Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. We proceed on our discussion where we last left off on the topic of tajsim. And this leads me to the next question, Sheikh. There's a claim out there regarding Imams Ibn Hamid, Qadi Abu Yala, Ibn Az-Zaghuni, and others. They're accused of tajsim. And the book of Imam Ibn Al-Jawzi is used as evidence for this. Could you
Right.
please explain this issue?
Okay. The three imams in question, rahimahumullah, they predecease Imam Ibn al-Jawzi with the exception of uh, Ibn Abi Ya'la, who wrote the Tabaqat al-Hanabila. He died 526 Hijri, and he was one of the students of his father, and also taught Imam Ibn Jawzi, who died 597. What has to be remembered is this discussion was an in-house discussion. This book, Defa Tashbih, this book was actually an in-house discussion. And the in-house discussion centered around the principle of doing tafweed or la kayf wa la ma'na at all times. Imam al-Jawzi rahimahullah's position was that if someone does tafweed at all times, he maintained that this is not possible. This is simply, it's impossible to do, because there will be certain times where one may have to engage in ta'wil just for a text to have sense made of it. One example being the hadith, I saw my Lord in his best form. And the Bihi, he said, there's no way you could take this statement and make tafweed of it without other possible things coming into the mind of a believer.
Right.
You would have to make ta'wil. Now, these people, Al-Qadi Abu Ya'la the Elder 458, Ibn Az-Zaghuni, and such, they died before Ibn al-Jawzi.
Right.
They died before his time. So that's why you have to understand this is an in-house discussion. In addition to this, the text Defa Shubha Tashbih, that book is not his final book.
Right.
And as is the habit with the scholars of the Hanabila, they tend to write books in a series. So they'll write a running series of kutub.
Yes.
Sometimes they'll have one book that's a catch-all text, like Lumat al-I'tiqad is a catch-all text that encompasses a lot of different things. But you'll also have a series of books. So Imam Wafid ibn Qudama, for example, has Al-Munazar fi al-Quran, Al-Sarkhad fi al-Quran, As-Sirat al-Mustaqim fi Qadm al-Harf al-Qadim. These are books that talk about the understanding of the Quran being the speech of Allah that's uncreated, right? And then Dhammut Ta'wil will be the dispraised, the censured nature of Ta'wil, which deals with the topic of why the Hanabi don't do Ta'wil and so on and so forth. There's a running series. Well, Ibn al-Jawzi is no different to this. He has Sayd al-Khatir, which has a lot of his theological positions on the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You have his book, his tafsir literature. You have his text, and it's his final creed text, which is Akhbar al-Sifat. And Akhbar al-Sifat is his final statement.
Oh, okay.
Now, the curious thing about the people that would latch on to the Defa, the curious thing about them is that they would not notice that the Defa, when you look at the manuscripts that it's collected in the different museums, it's usually appended to or annotated with reference to Kitab Akhbar al-Sifat.
Okay.
And it's extremely strange why they've chosen not to make reference to that. Because Kitab Akhbar al-Sifat details his unique understanding of this particular topic. And it's for this reason that Imam Rajab rahimahullah, in quoting Muwaffiq Qudama's biography on Ibn al-Jawzi, he says that he was an imam of the Sunnah. Muwaffiq Qudama says of him, but we differ in some of the things he said about the Sunnah. And the word Sunnah in the parlance of the Hanabila usually means the creed. We differed with him in those things. He didn't say he's Ahl al-Bid'ah or whatever else. And there's no biographical literature as well listing Ibn al-Jawzi as Ash'ari.
Right, yeah.
There's no biographical literature at all. In fact, if you read Sayyid al-Khatir, there's actually hostility towards, without mentioning their name, there's hostility towards the position of the Ash'ari because of the ta'wil. But they assume that his, Ibn al-Jawzi's ta'wil is the same thing as the ta'wil as the Ash'ari, and it's not.
And he was upon a sort of a partial tafweed.
Well, let's talk about him.
All right.
When we look at Imam al-Jawzi, we have to remember when you refer to something as a sifa, as an attribute, there are ayat of the Quran and ayat and ahadith, and together those are called akhbar al-sifat, the narratives that mention sifat. Now, Imam Ibn al-Jawzi rahimahullah said, when you refer to sifat, you have to remember that some of these are idafa. Idafa is a possessive construction in Arabic that refers to ownership of something. Like when you say Yedu Amrin, Amr's hand, right? Baytu Ahmed, Ahmed's house. So Ibn al-Jawzi rahimahullah, he said, because when you talk about a sifa, that's generally what tends to be said is Yadullah or Wajhullah, the Yad of Allah, the Wajh of Allah, or the hand of the face of Allah. These are attributes. Bal yadahu mabsutatan, but his hands are both outstretched, right? Surah Al-Ma'idah 64, right? This is sifa, right? But Imam al-Jawzi rahimahullah said, some of these aren't necessarily akhbar al-sifat. They're idafat.
Subhanallah. In
which case, a sifa isn't always being referred to. Or if expressions are being used like bihi, which is the dhamir, like it's a possessive form that's referring to something, that might necessarily not be a sifa, but instead it's just an idafa of ownership.
Subhanallah.
Right? So this is an in-house discussion that was being had between him, Muwaffiq Qudama, Shaikh Abdul Qadir Al-Jilani, Ibn Idrus, and people of similar quality. This was not an ummah-wide discussion. That's not what this was for any state of the matter. And if one reads Akhbar al-Sifat as well as his Zad al-Masir fi Ilm al-Tafsir and the Sayyid al-Khatir, you can see that he falls down in the great majority of times on the position of tafweed.
Yes.
His issue of ta'wil is not the ta'wil of, oh, this means istawla, this means that. That's actually not his position. His position is when you have texts in which an idafa is there, is this idafa one of tasharruf, one of honor or nobility because it's being attributed to something? Or is this idafa one of a sifa in which it belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and he's attributing it to himself?
SubhanAllah.
What exactly is this? But Imam al-Jawzi rahimahullah has not affirmed in Akhbar al-Sifat or Zad al-Masir fi Ilm al-Tafsir or the smaller texts of tafsir as istiwa, as istawla on any matter of topic. Nor has he ever said that yadahu means ni'matain or qudratain.
Right.
Or these type of things, the things that are popularly known to the Ash'ari, he's never referred to these things. And he's also made it a point, because this time was very significant, because this is the time after Al-Qadir Yala, rahimahullah, the elder who died 458. He was very particular in that the akhbar al-sifat that are agreed upon as being listed, the akhbar al-sifat, they have a haqiqah, they have a wujud, they have a reality. They're not majaz.
Yes.
Now, when you have certain texts, like for example, وَجَاءَ رَبُّكَ وَالْمَلَكُ صَفًّا صَفًّا, and your Lord has come, and the angels in ranks.
Yes.
Now, the Maji in Surah Al-Fajr, the 89th surah that is being referenced, the 23rd ayah, the Maji that's being referenced There are texts where this was brought to the attention of Imam al-Jawzi rahimahullah, and he said, this is not one of the akhbar al-sifat.
Right.
This is an idafa. Right. And he put that with another ayah in Surah Al-An'am that mentions when your Lord comes, the signs of your Lord or the angels. He said, well, you see, the maji here is an idafa construction, is not necessarily a sifa.
It's
right.
interesting that people use this ayah as a proof to say that the Hanabala and the Salaf were upon tafweed, but this is really abused, actually, this ayah.
Well, because it's a misunderstanding of what is entailed as akhbar al-sifat.
Right, exactly.
It's a complete misunderstanding. That's not the listing under akhbar al-sifat. That, oh yes, this is one of al-sifat of that or something like this. That's not under the topic. Another example is in Surah Al-Qalam, the 68th surah, near the end, this ayah, when the saq is laid bare and they'll be called to make sajda and they will not be able to. The saq, made reference to, the scholars of commentary are all clear that this is in reference, because whenever you talk about yukshafu an saq, this means shaddatul amr, the severity of an affair, the seriousness of an affair, right? So Ibn Jawzi says this is not from the akhbar al-sifat, right? But there's another statement in Imam al-Bukhari, and Imam al-Bukhari, it mentions on the day of resurrection, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala shall reveal himself to the believers, it mentions that he shall yukshafu an saqi, that his saq shall be laid bare. Now Imam Jawzi rahimahullah, he says this hadith goes with the other hadith, and it's not it's an idafa of a particular affair, but it's not an idafa of a sifa. It's not. Whereas Hanabila, like Al-Qadi Abu Ja and others, say, well, these are two different subjects. The first one in Surah Al-Qalam is just talking about shiddatul amr, the severity of an affair. But in the other one, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually attributes it to himself, it is a sifa. Right? So there was a discussion about these affairs. That's why the book is called Kitab Akhbar al-Sifat.
Right, mashallah.
Because within that kitab, Ibn Jawzi explains the Akhbar al-Sifat and his methodology for explaining and saying, okay, this is an idafa construction which represents tasharruf, and this is idafa construction that represents al-Sifa. But none of this runs in line with anything that would be presupposed today by some people who would attribute themselves to the Ash'ari and say Ibn Jawzi was an Ash'ari, because if you read Akhbar al-Sifat or Difa Shubha Tashbih and Sayd al-Khatir or Zad al-Musir fi Ilm al-Tafsir, how you would come to the position that Imam Ibn Jawzi was an Ash'ari, you would be uneducated at best.
Right.
You'd be uneducated.
And would you say this is due to lack of knowledge on comparative theology? This
is part of it, because al-fiqh al-muqarin is as important as al-i'tiqad al-muqarin.
Right.
You know, comparative fiqh is as important as comparative creed. Now, if you like for example, I don't do a lot of comparative creed because the field of study that I'm in doesn't require it. But if you're going to be in an environment in which this would be needed, then you would require a certain knowledge of al-fiqh al-muqarrar. I mean, I've got enough to know about, like, for example, the Asr time, differences in some usul matters, but not in any detailed affair. Now, al-i'tiqad al-muqarrar is if you've studied your foundations and your foundations are established and solid, and then you decide to do further study, then you have to do further study with an eye of grasping the subjects at hand. And what happens to certain individuals is they will get down the points that Ahlul Sunnah are agreed upon and then start studying the cults immediately.
Right, exactly.
And they will assume that anything that they didn't learn must necessarily be from Ahlul Bid'ah or whatever else.
Yes.
And it's like, well, you wouldn't know that because you haven't gone into the detail enough with Ahlul Sunnah and then the affairs within them. And many of these people are punching above their own weight, because when you ask them, they'll say, oh, this is kufr, this is tajsim. When you say, why?
Right.
Well, it's likening Allah's creation. How? How is that likening Allah's creation? They can't explain to you why. Because they've been fed these talking points by people who are little more than elementary students of knowledge, who have come out of Dar al-Islam, learning from some students of knowledge, and then come into Dar al-Kufr and injected this thinking into people's minds. Because in the mid-90s, this wasn't here.
Right.
The flavor of the time was Salafiyah. Now the flavor is you all have to be Sufis, and oh yes, I have bay'ah with this person. Then after that, it's oh yes, people are coming home now. Instead of saying we are Shadlis or whatever else, before they were coming home, we are Salafis.
Yes,
that's exactly what was happening. People were coming home, we are Salafis, we're upon the way of the Salaf, and they clashed with their parents.
Right.
Then they started coming home after that. They went through that group and they said, okay, we are Shadlis, we are Bushishis. They came home and made a wide pronouncement to their parents, and their parents had to go through the whole process and cycle of grieving for their child, because they're thinking, what's wrong with my son? Now the latest incarnation is they come home, we are Ash'aris and Maturidis.
Right.
That's the latest incarnation. And you'll find people will go through these based upon the spirit of the age. They will go through these different phases and groups. And this is extremely dangerous, because it tells you either the personality of the person, or that they're easily influenced and prevailed upon by certain trends. And there'll be another trend after this, and people will move on to that one. But what you find is the people that are espousing this, and we are Ash'aris, were in the group before that, and they were in the group before that.
Right.
Because it's a certain personality type that goes towards fringe movements and wide pronouncements. Whereas the main body of Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah is one of balance and structure. And you'll find all the people that have went through this three-prong approach, they all have hostility towards the main body of the Muslims, which are the laity.
Subhanallah.
Right? You have the Salafis that have this thing, well, the laity, they don't know. We've got to teach them, they don't know. Then they go through the Sufi thing where they start making bay'ah and going to Sufi lodges and things. They don't know. And there's an exclusivity that's there. Then the current incarnation of what's being called Ash'arism, this current incarnation, which is kind of a distortion. We are Ash'aris. They must learn. But it didn't strike these people dumb at any one time to say, well, if they haven't been learning all this before, and we've been doing all this to them, maybe it's because they don't need to learn it. Or maybe their heart is already full with the ikhlas and the yaqeen that was already there. And the reason why what we're trying to teach them is not digesting is because they don't need it. Or they're already established on something else. Right? And then they'll quote the hadith about the majority while in the same breath attacking the majority of the main body of the Muslims. So which one is it?
SubhanAllah.
When you tell the main body, oh, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's tashbih and tajsim, but that's what the main body is believing, though. Yeah. But then they'll try to use the ahadith about the majority. Wait, well, which one is it?
Right. Yeah. This comes up always.
Which one is it exactly? Because if you're the main body, then why do you have to teach it to everyone? Why do you have to go everywhere and teach it to everyone? Imam Ahmed didn't have to go and teach his theology to everyone. They said, we're waiting on you. If you say that the doctrine of the Quran's created or the other matters are correct, then we go with that. If it's not, then we don't. He didn't go teaching around the world, teaching everything. That's not what he did.
Right.
So these are the issues that people have to think about. If it's the truth and everything else, then why do you have to go to different places?
So we are referring to this hadith of sticking to the jama'ah, to the collective, the majority. And what is claimed today is that since a lot of the scholars are known to be Ash'ari Maturidi, that this automatically seems to be to many the majority, but it's actually not. We're looking also at what the Salaf are upon and what the Awam are upon, actually.
Yes, and this is significant. And you can't even establish that for most scholars.
All right.
You
Of
can't
course.
even establish that for most scholars. Like, wait a minute, because then you have to start saying, so are you saying all the Ghumari brothers, the big hadith hufaz, the Ghumari brothers were all Ash'ariyah? When did they say that?
Yeah.
I have their kutub. When did they say that?
Yes. They were basically upon the Hanbali creed, the
Yeah,
adhering.
yes, if that's what we're going to call it. I mean, but they were not Ash'aris or Maturidi. So we're saying that all the scholars of Arabiya are Ash'ariyah, or are we going to do the whole thing where, oh well, all of Arabiya is Wahhabi, and that's really, is that what we're doing?
SubhanAllah.
All the scholars of Qatar are Ash'aris. All the scholars of Kuwait are Ash'aris. So Muhammad ibn Abdul Aziz ibn Mani was Ash'ari.
SubhanAllah.
You know, the scholars of Qatar are Ash'aris. The scholars of Bahrain are Ash'aris. They're all Ash'aris. Then why is there so much strife when this stuff starts to happen and it gets brought then? You know, it's because if this was such a done deal, then why did it cause so much strife? And if it was the majority, why can we look in historical literature and find the first Ash'ari missionaries carrying to the Malikis in 400 Hijri and such? Well, then what was there before?
Yeah, exactly.
The first Shafi'i Ash'aris that are made, I mean, these are historical facts that can be gleaned in books of literature. They're historical facts. So then what were the Shafi'is before?
Right.
Popularization of Abul Hasan Ash'ari's creed, like what were they before?
Right.
We have to start asking like these really honest questions. What were the Malikis? What were they then before?
Right.
Because they were in Andalus, far away from Abul Hasan al-Ash'ari. So what were they?
And we are even keeping in mind that even when Imam Abu Hasan al-Ash'ari and his students were alive, the Jama'ah was still not crystallized. It took
Yes,
really long.
yes, and this is another thing. So there was no those situations. Then you have, oh well, Abu Bakr al-Baqillani, he was one. Yes, but he was part of a no-name Jama'ah though.
Right.
Because it wasn't fully established yet. There was still discussions about whether the attributes had a haqiqah or they were majaz. Now, if you speak to them, well, now, oh no, the attributes they have, and they'll say, no, these are more. Yes, but that's because you went through an evolutionary process in which now you've reached us in this stage with which you are in. Now, you cannot be angry with the laity or the other body of scholars who are cautious about these affairs because they have a right to say, I'd rather not. Because we can't just go and pick up a book of the Ash'ari and read it without saying, now, wait a minute. You can't follow that, and that. Well, why? Well, that's before this time. Because at this time, this was going on. But this one now, this is the one that you do. Okay, this one's the one that we follow now. Yeah, okay. Right, so you have to have this constant issue. Right? Because of its evolution, because as I've said before, you have to remember the Ash'ari came out of the 72 sects. And before there was a crystallized Jama'ah Ash'ari, they were loosely referred to as Kullabiyya because they're following Muhammad ibn Kullab after the first repentance. And then the second repentance came after realizing that Ibn Kullab, there were problems, the second repentance. Right? So we have to be balanced. Right. In this regard to understand the historical realities. Now, if someone says, well, I'm going to study the books of the Ash'ari or Maturidi, and that's what I'll base my methodology around, that's fine.
Sure.
They're not begrudged for that. But don't say that this is the creed of the Salaf.
SubhanAllah.
Don't say that, because Imam al-Nawawi says that it's not.
SubhanAllah.
Al-Qadi Iyad says that it's not Maziri. And that's not a knock on the Ash'ari. It's being historically accurate.
Yes, certainly.
They said there are two methodologies. And when Nawawi gives them, as we discussed just a moment ago, not long ago, where he said that the creed of the first three generations in great preponderance, or all of them, is, which is exactly what I said, without meaning. Right. Right. This idea of ta'wil, he himself acknowledges this is a later phenomenon.
As a side note, Sheikh, when you were studying at the Marhad, your shuyukh, they were from all the four madhahib, but the vast majority, or almost all of them, they were not upon the Ash'ari and the Maturidi Jama'ah, right?
No, no, they were not. There was one sheikh that was there, um, and I would say he had leanings towards the
Mm-hmm.
Ash'ari in other areas, but it was completely different to what's being put across today
Mm-hmm.
as the Ash'ari. Like for example, you could tell his leanings because he was reading regularly from Safwat Tafasir by Muhammad Ali As-Sabuni rahimahullah. He was regularly reading from that. And that book, if you read that, you're like, ooh, yeah, there's definitely, some signs of Ta'wil and some other
Okay.
things, right? So you could tell that he had those leanings because usually when we went in tafsir, he would cite that because that's kind of like it's almost like a mukhtasar of tafsir ibn Kathir.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like a mukhtasar of that, but there's like a exhaustive commentary notes and things on there, and some of the notes would have an inclination towards ta'wil. So we knew, oh, subhanallah, he has that proclivity, but it was never something that we pressed him about, or that he pressed us about, or that he regularly made it a point to go out of his way on. But he would just let us know that, listen, this is there. This discussion is there. So we were much more cosmopolitan in this regard. We had students amongst us that were cosmopolitan, but we had never had the types of knockdown, drag out battles that people are engaging in at this particular time. And it's not because it's a new trend in the ummah. It's a new trend online among a small
Sure.
body of people
Certainly.
who are infected by another small body of people. And I had to tell a lot of Muslim brothers around me, stop getting into these internet debates about who's this, because in reality, when you go and study with teachers and people who are really in the know and in the main, these things never come up.
Right. Mm-hmm.
They either never come up or the historical reality is established and explained and put in its proper perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of the stuff that people are harping on now, these are things that the historical reality is known.
Mm-hmm.
And intelligent people know better than to get themselves locked into these types of things, because when you go to the actual kutub and look at them, you can see that there's a uniformity within Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah that's there. So making one party Ahlul Bid'ah and one is not, and especially when you start dealing with expressions like tashbih and tajsim and these types of things, which is takfir language. This is takfir language. These jama'at, the mushabbiha and the mujassima, we know who their names are and we know their members. Like they're listed in the literature of the Firqa Dalla, and there's no Hanabila listed among them.
SubhanAllah.
But some of the early Ash'ari came out of them. But that makes sense though, because as we said, the Ash'ari are from the 72. They came out of that reality. So they had Mushabbiha and Karramiyya and Mujassima amongst them.
SubhanAllah.
And that's why Abu Hassan Ash'ari, he spent so long teaching them the negative. We don't believe this. We don't believe that. We don't believe this. We don't believe that. Right? Until finally bringing about the text of a positive identification of i'tiqad, which was the al-Ibana, and then his final statement, al-Luma.
Yes. And this is actually the reason why I asked this question about your teachers, because it is not to ridicule the Ash'ari or Maturidis in any way, but to disprove the claim that all the scholars are Ash'ari Maturidi, whilst your teachers were from Sham, Egypt, Mauritania,
Yeah.
Hijaz. They were all Sunnis, but yet they were not upon these Jama'at.
Well, you have to keep this in mind, that when you make these type of statements, if you go to one of those people, or you go to scholars and you ask them forthrightly, then you find them saying no, you're thinking, well, then what do you do with this?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Because when you say everyone is this,
right,
everyone all has this position, we can go to different kutub and examine and find out what someone is and what their position is.
mm-hmm.
Right. So you have Sheikh Muhammad Abdul Hakim Abdul Latif Tawaymiri, who was the most recent Sheikh al-Qadi of the big Qadis of Egypt before al-Masrawi. He was a big Hanbali Sheikh. So he wasn't one. The one before him, Ahmad Dabbagh Zubair, he wasn't.
Sure.
And neither was Al-Husri. Like we can tell from their books what they've said and clear statements and questions that they were asked that they were not. So then why did they miss the mark?
Correct, yeah, exactly.
Why did they miss the mark? Is it the case that Tanta, because many of these big Qurra, they went to Tanta, which was a major area, things like this. Did they just not figure it out? Or Sheikh Mustafa Bisa, who was the big Qari, he wasn't. So is this because they missed the mark and somehow the deen didn't get to them? Before they could do all these qira'at and everything else, they had to have some grounding in i'tiqad.
Sure, definitely.
You can't just progress to one thing and you're not grounded in the other. Now, true enough, Al-Azhar, that is their primary bent, because of the fact that the one that took it from the Ithna Ashariya, because this was originally Ithna Ashari school that was built up by Al-Qahir Billah, who named Cairo and everything else, and the Fatimiyya Shiites built this. The one that changed the curriculum was Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, who was Ash'ari. That's not, rahimahullah, that's not in dispute. Or the Qarawiyyin, which is another institution that is Ash'ari. That's true. But those are not the only institutions, and they're not the only ones ever built, and they're not the only scholars on the earth. And even the scholars that attend there are not all Ash'ari. Muhammad al-Sayyid, Mansur al-Buhuti, Mar'i bin Yusuf al-Karmi, they were Azhar attendees, gatherers, teachers, and alumni, and they were not. Someone, just because they attended Al-Azhar does not mean that someone will be Ash'ari.
Right, exactly.
This is not established. We have Yusuf al-Barqawi's theology, as well as Abdul Ghani ibn Yasin al-Lubadi. So they were not. That goes without saying.
Right.
Now, because they were not, what happens is they wind up teaching on what's called the rawaq. The rawaq is the ledge or the veranda, because they're teaching, they're kind of like adjunct professors. Because they're not full professors there, because they would have to teach those books. And they don't necessarily want to. So they're like adjunct or visiting professors or what have you.
And because those are the university regulations or the laws there?
Yeah, well, they have their own curriculum, don't they?
Sure.
They want to teach this curriculum, just like the Dar al-Hadith al-Ashrafiyya by, which is in Damascus, which Ibn Kathir attended. The condition for teaching there is that one has memorized the Kutub al-Ash'ari and subscribes to their theology. So the only people that would have attended there, the fact that Ibn Kathir attended there is necessarily the case that he was Ash'ari. Because in order to attend there is a condition. Why? Well, because the Ash'ari, because you have to remember Ibn Kathir dies 774. The Ash'aris are making up the numbers because they're still not a large enough Jama'ah. That's why they're making those requirements, because they're not a big enough Jama'ah.
Yeah, Imam al-Zahabi, he's also a graduate of that university.
Yes, but we find in his Tadhkiratul Hufaz, as well as Sir A'lam al-Nubala, that he was not.
Okay, subhanAllah.
Because now he might have been upon attendance there, but from an examination of historical records and things by him and what he wrote by his own hand, it seems to be the case that he is not.
SubhanAllah. Okay.
And some would say, well, that's because of his influence by Taqi ibn Taymiyyah. No, because he wasn't exactly the most erstwhile student of Taqi ibn Taymiyyah either, because he had qualifying statements about Taqi ibn Taymiyyah's positions as well. So he walked a real middle road. He walked a middle road.